we are going to go talk to Devin, he, they pronouns in California. Wants to talk about people worshiping two religions at the same time. That's kind of an interesting topic there. So, hey, Devin, you're chatting with Secular Rarity and JMike. What you got for us?
Oh, hi. So I actually did not think I would be the first one to be called.
Hey,
sorry.
Congrats.
I'm just really shocked. Anyway, it occurred to me once that there are people who often worship two religions, two cultures, and two types of afterlife. Some people believe in heaven and reincarnation, like someone who can believe in both the reincarnation of Hinduism or Buddhism, and the heavenly afterlife of Catholicism or Protestants. So it really makes no sense to believe in both, because don't all religions have a thing where that says you can't worship these other gods, saying that it'd be blasphemy or anything like that?
Yeah, so kind of. So like, I'm first off, I'm not an expert on Hinduism. I'm not an expert on comparative religions or anything like that. But from my study of Hinduism, the flexibility that exists in being a part of that religious mindset is pretty broad, right? So there are people out there who take the label of Hindu for a lot of different reasons, and also it's worth noting that some of these ideas in different religions are mutually exclusive, right? Like I would definitely argue that if the God of the Quran, Allah, as represented in the Quran, exists, right, that claim against the claim of Jesus Christ being Lord, right, Jesus being the incarnation of God, like those are mutually exclusive. Those both can't be true at the same time, right? But with some beliefs, they can be, even though they might seem contradictory at first, right? Like, how does reincarnation really work with an actual like eternal hell or an eternal heaven? Well, there are ways that it could, right? Like, especially if you think about it in a sense of like multiple layers of heavens, which is very much common in ancient Near East scriptures and stuff. So I think both the Quran and the Bible do have mentions of there being like different versions of heaven.
It's kind of 3-layer view or something like
right,
that.
right. It's like different layers. It's like going through a bean burrito. You gotta get
purgatory of the being a bug or whatever.
That's right. That's the mayo layer is just the sitting around doing nothing. But does that kind of help a little bit?
It does a bit, but in all honesty, it does seem a little too. It does seem a little like that perspective of people where they feel like they don't believe in a specific religion, but believe in a higher power kind of thing.
How often do you run into this type of belief? Because like I don't really run into this that often. And when I do, it's maybe someone that takes like a perennial type of view where it's like all the religions are true. There's just
I run into that one. I actually run into that one quite often.
Okay, so I don't as much. I mean, I think I have. I mean, would you agree that well, we're pattern seeking, obviously, but we're really good. I guess I'll take it from this angle. We're really good at if there's seemingly a contradiction, we're really good at making that work, right? We can play the accordion with text really well, and I don't think that we can just play the one accordion at a time. I think people can string together multiple accordions and play them at once and stretch it to as far as you can. So, like, you would agree that it's pretty easy to work hard at making that work, right? Like, you can do that theoretically.
I can agree on that.
Yeah,
I can agree.
And that's the thing I would just point out is to kind of analyze the view and see if you can point out the contradictions. Because if you go through that dialectic where you're like, hey, you said this about this thing, and that contradicts this other thing here. Like, how are you reconciling that? When they make the move to either concede and say, hey, I have some work to do. Like, if they don't make that move and instead they just you see them in real time working hard to reinterpret, it might not even be worth engaging that other than just letting them know, look, the only thing you're doing is just post hoc rationalizing. I mean, you're just doing what you could do with any piece of data. You know, I can come up with a story because I had good Mondays for several weeks, that there was an entity that desired for me to have good Mondays, had the ability to give me good Mondays, and no reasons not to give me good Mondays. And boom, every time a good Monday happens, I'm like, evidence for good Monday fairies or whatever. And so we can do this. Like, it's pretty easy to construct a story.
I guess it just seems like there's so many different rules that contradict each other. Some that make no sense,
Sure.
some that just seem outright stupid, and honestly, it just, at some point I'm like, what the hell? What is culture at all?
Yeah, and I think especially when it comes to like belief systems, right, and worldviews and all that good stuff. One thing that happens very regularly, and we can argue back and forth forever about whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing or whatever, but like it seems to be that humans do this thing where we do just kind of pick and choose stuff that feels better to us sometimes, right? Like we spend 30 years of our lives being a hardcore evangelical Christian, and then we read one book that mentions karma in a really vague, broad sense, and we go, I kind of like that too. I feel like that works, and I'm just going to incorporate that into how I view the world. That just seems to be something very innate to being a person, right? We do that with everything. Yeah, and so it's like when we come across certain ideas in our own system for how we navigate the world, we come across certain ideas that present problems to us, right? And a lot of times it's just easier to do that thing JMike was saying, where we just go, actually no, the reason that this isn't a problem is because of this thing that I just read about yesterday or just realized 5 minutes ago when you asked me. That is that plus that let's just grab a little bit from here and there and mash it all together in one view. That is just very, very human. And yeah, unfortunately, it can be super duper frustrating when you're in a conversation with somebody, especially when they're trying to present their view as being correct and true. One thing I would definitely say, engaging in those conversations is worth asking, is what is the criteria that the individual used to pick those different beliefs, right? Like if you do have this belief,
I guess I see that.
Say again, go ahead.
I guess I see that same thing with me. I believe that there can be an infinite number of universes, but that's really because it's a possible thing in theory, because in physics that has more merit to it, really.
Sure. And I think this is why you'll hear me, at the very least. I know a bunch of other people talk about this too, but you'll hear me talk about how important consistency is, right? And this is kind of why, right? Because I would argue that when it comes to accepting the claim that there is a potential for multiple universes, right? That is fully consistent with things like skepticism, right? With things like critical thinking, as opposed to, let's say, accepting that we have a soul that's going to be reborn into a different living creature or whatever. Like, I didn't do a great job with this life, so now I'm going to be a cactus or a beetle, which I could argue are better forms of life. It's being a human kind of sucks sometimes, is we've got these really terrible bodies. But the point is, like, we should strive for consistency as much as possible. And when we notice that either others or ourselves are just seemingly kind of blindfolding and just pointing to different beliefs and mashing them together, we should ask ourselves and others, why aren't we more consistent, and try to be as consistent as possible. And I think this is one of the examples as to why that's important, because what happens when you're not consistent is you start to hold these two different beliefs that are explicitly contradictory of each other. And so now you believe that, A equals not A, and that's problematic because that just doesn't seem to be the case anywhere. So, but any other thoughts you got for us, Devin, before we let you go and talk to some other people?
Yeah. If I had to put a term to what a description of what people's perception of God is like with or common people, it seems more comic book like than it is actual religious text like. Also, what your question on the free will thing earlier, I believe free will is an important thing, because without it, your individuality, your whole self, your everything about you would be synthetic and not organic.
Ooh, that's interesting. That could be a fun little topic. Do you want to go down that, JMike, for a second? I don't know if that interests you, but that kind of interested me, because I think even without, so again, let's take the concept of free will as this. If we were able to rewind the clock exactly to a minute ago, would you have said any different words? Okay, like let's think about it like that. In that sense, go ahead.
If I was aware of the clock rewinding, I probably would say something different just to see what happens.
Okay, so that's a good argument, right? Like, hey, I'd probably try it out, but the issue with that is you're already smuggling in the acceptance of free will there, right? So think about it like this. If we, because what you said was discussing that without free will, the idea of individuality wouldn't be real in the same way that we think about it now. Like when we see somebody step out of their house and they got this just killer looking suit on, they're just looking just super, super spiffy. We think, man, that person is individual. That person sat down, they got those clothes and they put it together because that's them. That's their personality. They're just, they're individual. When you bring in that concept of that free will, right? I can see how that comes with it, right? Because this person sits down, thinks about a choice, makes that choice. That's different from the other people. But how is individuality lost in determinism? And what I'll kind of pose to you for this is, if I have two rocks in front of me, okay, and I have a rock hammer, a hammer that's specifically designed to break these rocks, right? Well, when I hit those rocks, the force is determined there. We can map that out with physics and mathematics, right? If we know exactly the weight of the hammer and where it struck the rock, we can map out exactly where the cracks are going to go. And when I do that to these two rocks, they're both now different. They both crack in slightly different ways, right? Due to the mineral composition, due to maybe on this one, I swung it a little bit harder, but all of this is still determined, right? All of this in this framework is still determined. So wouldn't individuality still be possible in a world that is completely determined?
Not necessarily.
Sure, I'd grant not necessarily, but it doesn't seem to be categorically ruled out in the same way that you were thinking about it a minute ago.
Okay, so what you're, but basically, what you were saying was that the different types of rocks crack differently, correct? Even though the hammer is the same weight.
More or less. Really what I was going for was that even though in each scenario the consequences are determined and theoretically we could map them out from the beginning, each of those things, each of those entities still has and maintains that individuality, because there is something still different about each one of them, even in a determined world.
Yeah,
which
Yeah, you have differences. You have spatial differences, temporal differences. There's everything that separates properties that are not the exact same. But like, I'm kind of puzzled when you said you go back and you would answer just to try. I mean, you got to think though, when you go back, all the same factors are fixed the same. So like, think about if we were in a factory and we were making like green balls and red balls, right? I'm sorry, just red balls, and everything that explains why you get the red ball is all these very specific ingredients, and we go back to the machine, right? All of the same ingredients. We go back in time, all of the same factors, and we say, how could we explain a different outcome, like a green ball? Right? It's going to be really hard to say that it's going to be possible to get a green ball when you go back and look at all the factors. They only produce the red ball. And so similarly, when you go back, all of the factors are the same. It's not like there's something about you that's different that could help to explain why you get the different outcome. Now, if we got a green ball, me and you would look at each other and say, oh, well, someone must have put like green dye in it, right? Something must have changed here to get that different outcome. And so I'm not seeing how, with all the factors fixed, you're going to get a different outcome. With all the factors fixed, with the red ball making process, that you're going to get a green ball, right? It just seems seems like it's going to explain why you get that at each time.
Okay, but what if your intention wasn't to make a green ball? What if it was to change the shape of the ball to something else?
Well, I'm using these two things as two different analogies. The point is that if we look back and all of the same things, all of the same components are the same, how could you expect a different outcome, right? If we put everything in the machine the same way we did, how are you going to expect a blue ball or a green ball? You would have to explain that by something different. And so if we rewind the clock, there's nothing different. You're going to get the same outcome.
Yeah, but I feel like awareness has to be accounted towards that as well.
But you wouldn't have the awareness of the clock being rolled back in this thought experiment, right? It's not as if we're not saying that you as Devin, as person, exist for this time period, and then we pause time and then rewind it with you maintaining all of that knowledge. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that we stop the clock at any point in time and just roll it back 30 seconds ago. So anything that happened in that 30 seconds doesn't exist yet. Okay. And so it's basically you don't know. You have no experience of the clock moving forward for a minute and then stopping and then coming back, right? We're not saying, like, for instance, there's the thought of, hey, if I could do everything in my life all over again, knowing what I know now, I'd do things differently. And it's like, well, yeah, sure, because you've had the experience. There's no problem there. Nobody's pushing back on that. What we're pushing back on is, if without JMike's knowledge, if this were possible, if we could go back to last Sunday in the timeline, would JMike still have cornflakes for his breakfast in the morning? Which I have no idea if he did, by the way. But you see what I'm saying? He doesn't have the knowledge of the next week that occurred, to like think about and go, oh, okay, now let me try and make something different. He's just literally in the boat of waking up again on Sunday morning, just the same as he did a week ago. And so in that case, that's where JMike's saying, what has changed in terms of the inputs to the machine?
Exactly. It's like you could rewind it back to Tuesday when you were working that day and just isolate just the machine. And you're going to say, could the machine, if we rewind the clock, produce a different color ball? And the answer is no. The ingredients and the things in it explain why you get that specific outcome. And so now you just apply that to brains, right? Someone's gonna have to mount an argument that there's like some special magical stuff going on in the brain, that they're gonna have to give some argument or evidence for that. Otherwise, the view that I have, or the view that I'm most sympathetic towards, I'll say that if the brain just is neural, or mind just is neural states, and those are all the same and they're fixed, and the genetic dispositions I have, how my genes are expressed are all the same, right? All of that held fixed. It seems hard pressed that we could say we'd get a different outcome. That's all we're saying. I mean, you could salvage free will in a compatibilist sense, you know, but I'm strictly just talking about what's called libertarian free will.
Right.
This being able to do otherwise, but
Yeah,
I don't know. I
every
just let you go ahead, Devin.
time-
Sorry. Yeah.
Every time I hear the word libertarian, it's just all I can think of is people like Ben Shapiro.
Politics.
It's a bit triggering. I understand.
It's a different, different usage.
Right.
Libertarian free will doesn't have to do with politics.
More in that sense of that older version of liberty. But yeah. Any other thoughts before we let you go, Devin?
All right. Building on what you said about it, I guess I would have to say that if something has already happened, that there's no changing it, but that doesn't mean that there's no changing. There's no preset ideas. Like there's no, like, you know how people would hypothesize about traveling into the future. Well, then I'd have to think that there's no way to actually go forward in time. But whenever something happens in the past, it can't be changed.
Yeah, and that's fair.
So,
and I'd say there's a bunch of different people, of course, that do talk on this. Dan Dennett is a really, really good one for sure. So go check out some of his stuff, and that'll lead you down a path. You'll find a bunch of people who have talked about this for a really, really long time. And it's contentious. Don't get me wrong. It's not as if like JMike and I figured out, the super solid, everything's right answer to this. We as people have been discussing this as long as we have been around writing and talking to each other, because it really does kind of feel like we have free will. But yeah, seriously, go check into this some more. Like I said, Dan Dennett is a great place to start. He is a compatibilist. So you'll get a good understanding of that. And call us back when you get some more info, and I don't know, maybe you can call us back and say, hey, this was the argument that made me stop believing in free will entirely, or hey, JMike SR, I've got the argument that's going to make you start believing in libertarian free will, because we always love that, man. So thanks so much, Devin. We really appreciate your call.